Well, welcome everyone to the Worlds and Wonders of Speculative Fiction here with SouthWest Writers. You scared it out of me, David. We've got tonight's speaker, David Corwell, is one who writes a lot of short stories primarily. That's his genre, and he does it in horror and suspense. So he's going to be talking about how he creates these and how he gets into all these great publications. As a matter of fact, he gave me a listing of some of them here. And we were going to talk a little bit about them, and we've got the extra time to do so. This was the first one that came up. David, you want to talk about it?
Sure. So Cloaked in Shadow, this is a dark fantasy collection of all elf stories. So the theme, it had combined elements of horror and fantasy. And then, of course, your character, main character at least, had to be an elf. And so for this story, I created a piece called Legacy of the Kadana. So I basically came up with 3 elvish tribes. I loosely modeled them after Native American tribes. And I wanted a Southwestern style elf story, since I love everything Southwestern, and I wanted to incorporate it into a fantasy setting. So that's what I did. The setting is a big mountain called Syndramus, and the elves lived around it, and there's ongoing conflicts with the humans and so on. And the story is about this elf leader who goes a step too far in what he's planning, and it doesn't end well for him. Can't hear you, Rose. I think you're on mute. There you go.
Sorry, this should have just gone to the next one. There it is. Go ahead. And this one was another.
So Hazard Yet Forward. This is a charity anthology put out by the writers from Seton Hill University. Seton Hill has a Masters of Popular Fiction Writing program. I'm one of their graduates from that program. And there are 76 of us in this anthology. It has all different genres. It has mystery, romance, horror, science fiction, and fantasy. The proceeds of the book went to support a fellow classmate. Her name is Donna Monroe. She had developed breast cancer at that point. So this was to help support her in that. I'm pleased to say that Donna just published her first novel. It's called Revelations Poppet Cycle Book 1. And she published it at 50 years of age. So we're real proud of her. And my story in this one is a scary little pumpkin story. It's actually one of my short stories. It's 200 words long. And it's actually a reprint. This is one of those stories you were mentioning earlier, Rose, where we're trying to get our name out there. And this was one of the first stories I ever wrote. So this story originally appeared in a online fiction anthology called Dead in 13 Flashes. It was a Halloween anthology. And then it appeared in a Daily Flash. I think you'll have a cover up of that one soon. And then it finally made a third appearance in Hazard Yet Forward. So this is a way to keep my name out in front of the readers of this particular genre. And there's the Daily Flash one. This was a fun project because it was 365 days of flash fiction. So there is a piece for every day of the year. I was hoping that mine would actually show up on Halloween. It did not. For some weird reason, they put me in July. So Halloween in July, I guess. The story is called The Harvest. And it's, so my family and I, we have a yearly ritual where we get together and we carve jack-o'-lanterns. We carve between 30 and 40 every year. And it takes over about a week to do so. And then we line them up along our front yard. It's become kind of like a neighborhood attraction. and people love to come and see what we've carved for that particular year. Some years we have themes, others we don't, but I've been doing this for quite some time now, and I have over like 300 pumpkin carving patterns. So we have a lot of fun doing it. We have a little party, a get together, and so on. So this story is it's a creepy pumpkin story, and it came about from the fact that I started thinking, well, we're carving all these pumpkins. What if the circumstances were reversed, and the pumpkins were doing some of the activities, not the people? So that's what that story is about.
Ooh.
Tales of the Talisman. This is a publication of the publisher is called Hadrosaur Productions. It's based out of Las Cruces, New Mexico. And actually, David Lee Summers, who spoke last week, was the publisher. And I don't think David's on with us tonight. I'm not sure if the magazine's still in print. I think it might not be at this point. But it was a fun quarterly magazine. Had a lot of interesting stories, science fiction, fantasy, and horror. The story I wrote for this one is called Conqueror of Shadows. It's about a young Apache boy. His father has been cursed by an unknown assailant, and he goes out searching for the medicine man to see if there's something he can do to help his father, and he runs into some unexpected adventures. So it's a nice supernatural Southwestern style tale. And Tales of the New Mexico Mythos. This is a fun anthology. This is one of those situations where it pays as far as who you know. This editor was a classmate of mine in high school, Paul Bustamante. He had started a new publishing company, and he wanted to do some weird fiction based on the Land of Enchantment. So I am a Bigfoot fan. I like to think of myself as a skeptic, but there's always a possibility that it exists. So I wanted to write a Bigfoot story. And so I thought about this for a little while, and I've watched all the shows. You know, some of the shows are just absolutely ridiculous, like Finding Bigfoot. These people make me cringe with embarrassment seeing them with some of their antics in the woods. But one of the things that these Bigfoot believers always talk about is, or the skeptics actually, they say, well, if this animal existed, why are we not finding their physical remains in the woods? What happens to their bones and so on? So I basically wanted to write a story. I kind of took that question and ran with it. Why are there no remains found? And if there were some that were found, what would happen? And on top of that, I kind of intermeshed it with a Southwestern treasure story. There's a lost gold mine that's involved in this story. So I have a Bigfoot combined with a treasure tale, which was a lot of fun to write, I have to say. Dia de los Muertos. So this is a special one for me because my story in this anthology is called Susto. And my take on it was, I've always been fascinated by La Llorona, the weeping woman. That's been a story that I heard as a kid, as you know, my grandparents were trying to scare me into doing what they wanted me to do. So it's hung around for quite some time. And I wanted to write a story about the weeping woman that was a little different than everything that's been done before in horror. And especially you want to try to, I mean, there's no original ideas really. You just have to try to come up with a new twist on a concept. So La Llorona had been done to death, but I want to combine it with the Day of the Dead holiday. So basically, this is about a curandera, a female folk healer, who lost her husband the previous year. She's getting his altar ready to welcome him back for the celebration of the following year, when she inadvertently summons La Llorona as well. And so the story proceeds from there. This story is special to me in several respects. It was one of my very first stories that I wrote and polished and polished and polished and just kept trying to get published. It won the 2001 Southwest Writers Storyteller Award. And it was a milestone in my writing career because Tony Hillerman presented me with the award that year, which was really special. And it took 15 years, but I finally found a publisher who wanted to buy the story. And so it made its first appearance in this anthology here. And then it was taken up as a reprint in the Tales of the New Mexico Mythos anthology as well. So that story got 2 exposures. Voices of New Mexico. This is more of a mainstream New Mexico anthology. I believe several members have also contributed to this. I think you have a story in there, Loretta, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
this
I
was
do.
yeah. And I think Sue Hauser and maybe a couple of other people. I can't recall all the authors. In fact, I was trying to find my copy and it's disappeared. I might have sold the last one and it had all my signatures in it, which, oh well. Yeah, so the New Mexico Book Co-op had meetings pre-COVID, and they talked a lot about the publishing and marketing aspects of book publishing, basically. And they came up with this project. And what I wrote for this one was called Grandma's Hands. It's a memoir of my grandmother. So it's a pretty touching story. It was one of the hardest things I ever wrote, but it's some of my memories of her.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, sorry.
There you go.
Okay, so it gives you a little bit of a history of David and the wonderful things that he's been doing. As I was getting ready for this evening, I was doing some research, and I discovered, because I hadn't really known, you know, what was the official or unofficial, either one, first horror or suspense story ever written. And it's interesting because it's almost a tie. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818. And that was the first of the full stories that I found in history. But the Grimm fairy tales began in 1819. And those were never, they weren't your nice Disney fairy tales, even though Disney changed the endings and made them happy. Most of those were pretty ugly. I mean, Hansel and Gretel got eaten, and etc., you know? So they were rather dark as well. And then the next major one was Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. So starting from those as a basis, you know, and we're working forward in time, how do you think it's evolved, you know, from then to today? What kind of things, why does this making people feel fear? Why do they want to?
So that's a great question. That kind of segues into basically what is horror. So the definition of horror is an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. But it's a fear of the unexpected, the unusual, or the unknown. So really it can apply to anything outside our comfort zone, anything that kind of unsettles us. As far as horror fiction itself is concerned, I consider that the literature of dread. And so it is the genre of speculative fiction that evokes the emotional response in a reader, usually a fear or shock, but it's not limited to those emotions per se. And I think one of the reasons that it kind of retains its grip on us is because it takes us to the very edge of human experience. It's tackling a lot of taboo topics that aren't normally dealt with in other genres. It's just too uncomfortable to deal with. It examines issues we don't typically like to face, like the nature of evil, death. It actually forces us to look at ourselves sometimes too. We're looking at ourselves in the mirror, and there's so many facets to us as human beings. It's just one of those emotions that we have as human beings. We do have a dark side, and this genre helps us to look at that and kind of figure out what's going on with that darker side of things. But most importantly, horror fiction is fun. It really is fun. It's fun to read. It's fun to write. And why is that? Because it allows us to face a variety of fears. We can face fears in a vicarious way, allowing us to be brave and experience these things and then walk away without any immediate danger to ourselves. So, the real life horrors, no, we have a real hard time dealing with that. But when you're facing a monster or a situation that's in a book, it's very entertaining. It's exciting to be scared, and we can live through the experience and walk away unscathed. Stephen King had a quote. He says, "We make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones." And Ramsey Campbell also said that fiction should disturb, and especially disturb, the reader's prejudices rather than seek to reassure by indulging and confirming them. So it is examining various components of the human condition in ways that readers can experience without feeling too threatened.
Sue Ellen, you had a question?
Hi, David. Glad you're
Hi,
glad
how are you?
giving this talk. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Love your skull.
Thank you. I paid a visit to an independent bookstore here in Albuquerque.
Uh-huh.
Had a conversation with a gal that worked there, and she said that women have a harder time breaking into writing horror than men do. Now, I know that we have, people like Shirley Jackson and, Joyce Carol Oates, and of course, Rose mentioned,
Mary Shelley.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
So, do you find that to be true? And if that's, I have my own theory on why that might be, and I want to ask that after you answer this, but do you find that to be, we do hear about men writing horror more than we do women.
Right, yeah. I don't necessarily think it's harder for women to break in. I honestly know of several women writers who are into horror. There's Catherine Tasic, who is the wife of Charles Grant. There's Kathy Koja. There's P.D. Kasich. Mary Sangiovanni, who actually happened to be one of my classmates at Cedar Hill. She's published several novels. The authors you mentioned, I think there's been a move to try to promote these female authors more. There have been anthologies that female horror writers can submit to. I'm not sure what's currently being done as far as promoting works by female authors in the genre, but I know there are several working in the genre. And it's just a matter of the fact that maybe we just don't hear about them as much.
Okay.
Do you think that it's also still considered taboo to write about very dark topics for a woman to write about that? It's more widely accepted. And I'm just wondering, I'm just throwing this out there, more widely accepted by men versus women, just because of the nature of the ugly sometimes that can come of that.
Right. I'm sure there are instances of that, and I know every genre has its darker elements. There's in horror, there's the homophobia, the transphobia, the sexism sometimes. One of the tips that I'm going to provide later about writing horror is not to avoid stereotypes. One of the big ones has always been, the helpless heroine. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. We have a lot of strong female characters being written. And so I think authors who are on the cutting edge of this sort of thing are trying to get away from those stereotypes and come up with new material that's relevant for our current time.
Okay, so going on a little bit, David, what is the difference between, say, horror and suspense?
So suspense for me, well, the definition, the dictionary definition from a book of literary terms that I looked up, it's a state of or feeling of excitement or anxiety about what may happen. And to me, rather than, I mean, it is a genre, but I think suspense is, to me, is more an element of fiction. It generates a state of uncertainty and curiosity as to the outcome of a story. Whether it's a narrative in verse or prose. So to me, it's more a fictional element. It's important in all genres. I mean, if you don't have suspense, you're not going to keep your reader engaged in your story. So that being said, there are different types of suspense, and it does vary depending on the context of the story. In a general sense, narrative suspense begins with a question or a problem. You always want to have something, an unanswered question, or kind of start the story in the middle of action to try to get your readers pulled into the story. And then from that question or problem, you divulge more about it as your plot moves forward. And then of course you bring everything to a head at the climax. So that's the kind of the long-term suspense is working over the course of the story. As far as short-term suspense, that's basically a moment or a brief scene that evokes a powerful reaction from the reader. And examples of that are openings. You grab the reader, you hook them from the get-go and pull them directly in the story. Or if you're writing several scenes or a longer work of fiction, you also have those cliffhangers, ways to end scenes that just make your reader want to keep turning that page and continue on with the story. So types of suspense, it does vary depending on the context of the story. You can have mysterious suspense. It's the most traditional form of suspense. It's used in mysteries and thrillers. Basically the reader knows something is being deliberately hidden from them, but they're reading to try to figure out who is the killer, what's going on here, what's happening. Horrific suspense. The reader knows something bad is going to happen, but they don't know what, when, or where. So that element of danger just kind of grips them and keeps it very suspenseful. We have romantic suspense as will the couple eventually get together based on the circumstances of the story. We have comedic suspense. It's often presented as farce. You have some ludicrously improbable and situations. And so you're wondering how those are going to turn out. And then, of course, there's the whole thriller genre where you have a tension-filled story. These are really tension-filled. They have heightened feelings of anticipation, anxiety, excitement, and surprise. And this can involve elements of horror. It can involve mystery. It can involve a whole wide variety of genres. There's a whole variety of subgenres with the thrillers. And a lot of times they involve more realistic situations as well. You have crime stories, you have espionage stories, you have technology gone awry, that kind of thing. In fact, as I was kind of looking through books and things, I did find a book that I'm not sure if you're familiar with, Rose, but I thought it was quite interesting. It's called Collision. It's a story about, it says, the nerve-shattering novel of a sky crash by Spencer Dunmore.
I actually
I'm
have
not sure if
that.
you're familiar with that. Do you? Okay. I thought that was great. So yeah, suspense can involve any genre. It's just a matter of generating that state of anxiety or uncertainty that just pulls the reader along through your story. And so those are the kind of various types of suspense. And then you have like Bourne films and James Patterson and all those authors who write a variety of different types of suspense and thrillers.
One of the questions in the chat room is, are any horror topics considered kind of off limits?
No, if you can present them, I mean, horror is about stretching, pushing the edge, pushing the edge. You're dealing with things that some people might be offended by, but you're writing them in such a way that you're presenting them, and you're presenting them from your perspective and giving a point of view of those. And that's what settles the reader usually.
Yeah, and some
Yeah,
people get upset, some people get angry,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
So what would you say are the important elements of horror fiction?
So some tips for writing horror. Again, as I said before, there's no real original ideas, but you should aim for fresh perspectives, especially when you're revisiting traditional horror tropes. For example, if you're doing a traditional monster like a vampire or werewolf, you should have some kind of fresh take on that mythology. Otherwise, you know, that's been done to death. I mean, there's millions, hundreds of books out on vampires and werewolves and so on. So basically avoid cliches. Example, like The Devil Made Me Do It. You know, a lot of these possession films, The Devil Made Me Do It, and this and that. Cliches are really products of lazy writing. You as a writer have to come up with new ways to express your monsters, new ways of looking at things. Also avoiding stereotypes. Those should not be occurring in your book. Tradition shouldn't be used as an excuse to repeat what earlier writers have done or to perpetuate stereotypes. You want to go off on new venues and explore things from your perspective. Because really, if the story is too familiar or the character's too familiar, it loses the power to engage the reader. And especially in horror, you have to maintain that grip on your reader to keep them moving forward. I'd also suggest that you write to your fears. You want to make your horror personal. Draw from your own experiences and observations to create only those stories that you can write, because everyone has a different perspective on various life experiences. And really that original style that you develop as a writer comes from your roots, your emotional and your historical roots and those experiences that you've gone through. And of course, you can also fuel your subconscious by reading everything, listening to others, listening to other people tell their stories, and nurturing interests other than just reading and writing. So those interests actually might lead you to subject matter for your horror stories. And this is a no-brainer for any fiction, but create compassionate characters. You definitely want to create characters that the reader can identify and empathize with in some way. If they don't, you're really not going to have the reader invested in your story, because to increase that tension and suspense, the reader has to be emotionally involved with your characters. And of course, during the course of the story, you want the characters to change somehow as well, because that kind of gives it a depth and realism that's not there. If they come through some kind of extraordinary situation and they're not affected in any way or shape or form. And the other thing with horror is especially important is atmosphere, mood, and tone. You want to have a dark tone. You want to have like a menacing tone, something that has an underlying threat. There's something not right. Something is just kind of unsettling underneath what's going on. And you can develop this through dialogue and setting. And definitely word choice is extremely important. In fact, I did come up with a couple of examples that I wanted to read to you guys to kind of show what I'm talking about with this atmosphere stuff. So there's several authors that I have been influenced by as a writer, learning writing techniques. But the one that I really enjoy is, his name is, well, everyone knows him, Ray Bradbury. So Ray Bradbury wrote this dialogue in a story called The Wind. The phone rang at 6:30 that evening. It was December and already dark as Thompson picked up the phone. Hello? Hello, Herb. Oh, it's you, Ellen. Is your wife home, Herb? Sure, why? Damn it. Herb Thompson held the receiver quietly. What's up? You sound funny. I wanted you to come over tonight. We're having company. I wish you could come over tonight. Wish I could. Company and all. My wife killed me. I wish you could come over. What is it? The wind again? Oh, no. Is it the wind? Asked Thompson. The voice on the phone hesitated. Yeah, it's the wind. So there's something creepy going on there. This friend is calling another one, asking him to come over, but we don't know quite yet what's going on there. There's a threat of some kind there. And so word choice and the tone is extremely important in developing this type of fiction because it sets the mood, it gets the reader on edge. Here's another scene here that I want to read real quick. This is from William F. Nolan, and it's from a story that he wrote called The Ceremony. And he starts with, he passed the dim-lit garage. In the gloom, standing next to a high-piled stack of discarded truck tires, a lean, unshaven mechanic in greased, blood-dark overalls stared out at him. He continued along the street. The gravel gave way to concrete, but the ground was still uneven. Tufted grass spiked up from wide cracks in the surface. The ancient Victorian houses along the street were in equal disrepair, their gabled bay windows cracked and shadowed. Porches sagged, roofs seemed hunched against the night. Dewar's Mill had gone to seed, a time-worn New England relic of a town that seemed totally deserted. So again, word choice, atmosphere, tone, all that is extremely important in developing that menacing tone in horror.
Okay, I've got a question from Joyce. How much gore is too much in horror?
Interesting question, because there is not too much gore. There is actually a subgenre of horror called extreme horror or splatterpunk. And this basically is a genre that instead of using that atmosphere and mood, it uses graphic, often gory portrayals of violence to tell the story. It's known as the horror subgenre without limits. So everything is fair game. So yeah, these stories are pretty graphic. They can be even nauseatingly so. And so you have to have a strong stomach to get through some of these things. I've read some of these things, and it's basically the authors are using violence to try to revolt or shock the reader.
It seems to me like if they put too much gore in it or too much shock, you become numb. And,
right.
And it's not going to accomplish what the author really wants, because your mind goes, oh yeah, okay, I've seen enough blood. Let's go on and try and find a story in this.
Yeah. So there have been a lot of people who have tried to write this, and it is basically what you're saying. I mean, it's not really a story. It's more like a violent depiction of some kind of act. So the trick that these authors try to do is they're trying to make sure that the gore and the graphic depictions are critical to telling that story. It has to be an essential element of the story that still shocks the reader in some respect without just becoming a bloodbath.
Okay, then, so what are the important, you said the important elements of horror. What are the important elements pertaining to suspense?
So with suspense, you want to write compelling hooks. I mentioned the hooks and the cliffhangers earlier. So these are designed to grab your reader and to keep them on the edge of their seats. So one of my other favorite authors, his name is Dean Koontz. I'm sure you all know Dean Koontz. He's written a ton of novels, and one of my favorites is called Darkfall. And he is a master of suspense. He grabs you with the first line and kind of pulls you into the story. This Darkfall is a story about an ancient evil that kind of paralyzes the city in the middle of a blizzard. And so the prologue starts with Penny Dawson woke and heard something moving furtively in the dark bedroom. First sentence, and you're off. And you're wondering what the heck's moving in her bedroom. So he's definitely got your attention at that point. But yeah, openings are really important to hook the reader. Many of you will probably know this one off the bat. It says, no live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone.
That's one of the first ones I ever read when I was about 12.
Mm-hmm.
The Haunting of Hill House.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah, and going back to one of my stories, the Cloaked in Shadow story with the elves, my first paragraph was, the towering pine screamed with every chop of Zalbathos Kemendros's axe. The tree's tall practically writhed in pain. Its tormented cries rolled past him like a screeching wind, joining with those of the others in the clearing. So most people want to know what's going on at that point, and others may close the story. They're already scared. So, and then the same thing with cliffhangers. When you're writing a longer piece of work, or you want to keep your reader involved in the story, you want to end the scene also on an interesting note. So I have a couple examples of that as well. Let me find those real quick. Here's one from Stephen King, his book, The Shining. With growing trepidation, she walked down to the stairwell, but Jack was not there. And as she stood there on the landing, wondering what to do next, the singing came from below, rich, angry, bitterly satiric. Roll me over in the roll me over, lay me down and do it again. She was frightened even more by the sound of him than she had been by his silence, but there was still no alternative. She started down the stairs. So in this situation, she's heading into potential danger. And so you're wondering what's going to happen next. And so you'll keep reading. Here's one that kind of does something bizarre or confusing and just kind of makes you wonder what's going on. This is from Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child's book, Still Life with Crows. The car engine turned over, turned again, rattled and shook into life. She turned on the headlights and crept back down the bumpy track. After a few minutes, she couldn't stand it anymore. Well, she asked, how'd it go? Pendergast's eyes turned to her, glistening strangely in the night. I saw the impossible, was all he said. So yeah, it's important to do the compelling hooks and the cliffhangers to keep the story interesting and keep the reader on the edge of their seats. I won't belabor the point, but good characterization does lie at the heart of suspense. Again, if readers are not worried about your story people, the story's tension is just going to disappear altogether. Another big thing is anticipation is a key to suspense. So when your dreaded encounter between your characters and whatever evil they're facing draws closer and closer, the tension just kind of keeps building. And it's most effective when the author builds it in stages. So you're building it slowly. For example, I know you mentioned Aliens last week, and you haven't watched that movie, but in the second movie, we have these Marines going out to a planet to figure out what the heck's going on. They've lost touch with the colonists. And a lot of that movie is building up suspense for that eventual encounter with the aliens. but the tension and the suspense just kind of keeps ratcheting up until that first encounter. And then the action just kind of just goes full force from there. Same thing going back to Stephen King's The Shining. These people are isolated in this hotel all winter. They're the caretakers. But Jack, the main character, is losing his mind, and he's being influenced by the spirits in this hotel to the point where he tries to kill his own family. And so this is a 400 and some page novel. And over the course of this, Stephen King is just building this up in stages and getting you even more ratcheted up emotionally and more suspenseful as we go along. Another thing, we hear this in any genre, but showing versus telling is especially important in horror. You have to use all 5 senses. You want to immerse your reader in the situation, what the character is experiencing, because it makes that dread and fear more palpable if they're in the scene with that character. So a good example I found in a fiction book, and it's easy to tell things. I mean, it's a lot easier to get things down on paper that way. And that's great for a first draft. But if it's an emotion or a scene that you really want to ratchet up as far as emotional impact, you want to take the time to go through and rewrite it and show things instead of telling them. So, for example, he was nervous as he held the automatic. Well, that's kind of telling me that he's holding a gun. I'm not really invested in that. But if you say his palm was moist as it pressed into the cold handle of the automatic, that's telling us that he's nervous. We're feeling the gun in his palm as well. So it's a more immediate interaction with that character. So it's a little more gripping that way. And that's basically what you want to do with your showing versus telling. And of course, there's lots of other examples, but we won't take the time to go through that. You can use various stylistic techniques also to create suspense and to heighten the tension. Shorter sentences. If you're writing in longer sentences earlier in the scene, as the action starts getting more close and the tension is ratcheting up, you can use shorter sentences. You can use simpler words, shorter clauses and phrases. One good technique in suspense has always been the time pressure component, like the ticking clock. The bomb that's going to go off, say in a thriller, or there's this upcoming encounter with a folklorish horror of some kind, or a cosmic horror, think Cthulhu, that kind of thing. And you're trying to avoid this thing, but suddenly, there's no avoiding it anymore. So, you've got to do something before this event happens, or, this prophecy is going to come true, whatever the case might be. So all these techniques work together to create that sense of headlong forward motion that really increases the pacing of the novel and ratchets up the tension. And then, of course, a lot of suspense hinges on your villain too. So your villain has to be relentless and unstoppable, has to give the protagonist a run for his or her money. Definitely don't do a cookie cutter stereotypical villain. The best villains really evoke sympathy as well as terror. So they have some kind of humanizing component about them, even though they're doing something really dastardly.
Interesting. That actually makes me think of a book I'm working on, even though it's not really a horror book, but that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah.
So some of the characters that Halloween brings out, were based on the old witches and wizards, which were used to be considered evil at one point in history.
Right.
And over time, it has morphed, and now they're the heroes of some pieces. It's interesting how horror changes with time and cultures.
Yes, it's and of course that kind of stuff also creates new subgenres. You have like paranormal suspense, where you have the wizards and the witches who are the heroines. And there's elements of romance in the books as well. So they've combined elements of horror and the romance. And what's his name? Jim Butchner wrote
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Harry
urban
Dresden.
fantasy. Yeah.
I love Harry
Cult
Dresden.
Detective, correct. So stories like that, I mean, those are really great. And they have those dark fantasy elements in them. So they're a lot of fun to write too and to read.
Joe Brown in the chat room says, books written on or about religion often use horror, fear, suspense to get the reader to believe something. Are these considered horror or suspense piece to those writing within the genre?
Yes, there's a lot of horror and suspense works based on religion. You have like The Exorcist, you have Rosemary's Baby, all that kind of stuff. So that is perfect fodder for horror fiction. And it all depends on what the author's take is on that subject. They can make it personally their own and still use the underlying tropes to make the story stick together. Yeah.
Dan Brown's
Oh yeah, the Da Vinci Code.
Da Vinci Code and the one right after it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can't
Actually,
remember
the
what
one
that
right
one is.
after one that was
Yeah.
yeah, that one had
Oh,
so
don't
much,
they
you know, set in the Catholic Church,
Right.
and using that as a basis for fear to supposedly help society go forward in its
Right.
ignorance or something.
Right. And I just rewatched The Omen. Around
Ah.
here, October is Halloween month, so we watch as many horror movies as we can during the month. So we watched the remake of The Omen, which was based on the Catholic Church, and you know the son of the devil becoming all powerful through the politics, because his dad happens to be an ambassador, U.S. ambassador.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's different takes on religion and how to incorporate it into horror fiction. And you can also make it a suspense tale as well. It just depends on your focus.
And what's interesting is
Well-
that they turn around and take the horror that everybody is, you know, oh, the devil's all the horror, etc. And now they've added a comedic component to it.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden you've got a comedy devil.
Right.
Well, can I ask one thing or share one thing? Back when I
Sure.
went to the University of Colorado, I was taking some classes in anthropology, archaeology, and so forth. And one of my classes was cultural anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
The text, the chapter 5 was on religion and of course its aspects of creating culture. And the definition given for religion was man's tool to deal with those things he does not otherwise understand.
Mm.
And of course you could debate that, but
Right.
but as I went through that class, the instructor made me very aware that dread, suspense, and a lot of other things are embedded in many of what we consider our religious books, be it the Bible or whatever. And
Right.
and so it just gave me a completely different view, and it stayed with me of how the techniques you're describing, David, and how
Mhm.
they're used in the genres we call suspense and horror and so forth,
Right.
have been around forever and have been part of our culture forever,
Yeah.
even in the religious world. And I'll just
Right.
leave it at that. But I just kind of wanted to bring that up and hear what you had to say about it.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I mean, even the Greeks had tales of horror, you know, that kind of led to some of the more modern tales like Frankenstein, Dracula. We had the Gothic tradition that started in the 1700s. Horace Walpole wrote the Castle of Otranto. I think it was around 1764. That started the whole Gothic movement with the isolated heroines and forbidding castles and all that wonderful stuff. And then, of course, the ghost stories have been around forever as well. One of the reasons I started loving horror is because my mom used to read me ghost stories as a kid. That was our reading time together. And she liked all that spooky stuff too. So that kind of got me interested in the genre from early on.
Much of the genre, in a way, evolved from many of the tales of different cultures over time. Now, you mentioned La Llorona. The whole concept of Coyote, the trickster, who had bad things happening to children that were tales told by their parents to these kids in order to keep them from doing things that might hurt them. You know, that was one. And then, of course, Loki from the Norse tales was the same way. A lot of his tales were teaching tales, you know, yes, this is what a bad person looks like and what they'll do to you unless you're a good person.
Right.
You know, did some of our horror stories evolve from that platform?
Yeah, they did. And that's one of the fascinating aspects of horror for me, is all the different cultures and their stories and their legends, and it makes for some interesting stories if you want to pursue those things. A lot of fantasy stories and some dark fantasy stories I've been seeing lately rewrite those fairy tales. They present them in a modern context for readers, and those have been very popular. In fact, I'm trying to think, Theodora Goss has written some retellings of Cinderella, I believe, and Snow White, and they all have either a fantastic or a horrific bent to them. She's got a collection of stories. I can't recall what the name of it is, but it's been very well regarded, very popular.
Well, the originals for Snow White and Sleeping Beauty were nasty. I mean, she gets killed. It wasn't a prince comes up and kisses you and everybody lives happily ever after.
Right.
Thing.
The original Little Mermaid was the same thing. She doesn't become a human, and she becomes, you know, this bubble thing at the end, and just kind of goes up into the air and dissolves into nothing.
And that's Hans
I
Christian
still remember
Andersen.
being traumatized by that story as a kid.
So the Little Match Girl was another one. So let's see, The Bloody Chamber, Angela Carter, a mix of fairy tale, ghost story, horror. Alan, what were you wanting to say about that?
That sounds like a good one.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, Angela Carter, she did the series of like fairy tale horror in the 70s on like Sleeping Beauty and Bluebeard. That's very good as well. But like The Bloody Chamber, it's like a great collection of little short stories on horror that has like that fantasy element to it as well, fairy tale type. I just think it's a great collection. So.
Great, thanks for sharing that. You mentioned Bluebeard. Did she have a book about that, or was it a short story?
It's a book.
It's a book. Do you know the title of that one offhand? Because I actually have a Bluebeard tale that I'm writing right not It's called The Screaming Pumpkins.
Oh. Let me see. I think it's called, not off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, if you think of it, please let me know. That would be awesome. I'd love to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one I'm currently writing is called The Screaming Pumpkins. It's a Halloween tale, of course, because I love all things Halloween. And it's about it's loosely based on that Bluebeard story. And this my main character is trying to figure out what happened to her sister, and she's basically gone together with this guy who she suspects has done something to her sister. And so the story goes from there.
Okay. Do I have any other questions for David? I have notes here about Anne Rice. Who are some of the people in the room's favorite authors when it comes to horror and suspense?
Got to be Edgar Allan Poe. I was born in Baltimore, so I've been to Poe's grave when I was like 5, and my mom loved Poe. It's the only horror she could stand, and I realized she hadn't read all of it because she would never let me read it when I was a kid otherwise. But like you said, I've turned my son onto it. His last Christmas present, he didn't have the collected works. So he has the collected works of Poe. And it's like, here, you got to start off with this one and this one. And he's like, go away, Mom, I'll get through all of it. So he incorporates it because he writes Dungeons and Dragon scenarios. So when I finally gave him Poe, he's like, oh my God, I'm going to be able to write so much better. And all of his friends went, gee, Mom, thanks. We're dead. We're not even going to get, half hour into the game and Cthulhu or somebody's going to kill us.
Right. That's great. Yeah. There's a great, I don't know if you've seen it. There's a great movie, Halloween themed movie out called The Raven. It's
Yes.
about Edgar Allan Poe. It's an awesome movie, which has a mishmash of his stories thrown in there. Basically a serial killer's copying some of his stories and he helps out with the investigation. It's a really great movie. I enjoyed that immensely. In fact, that got me so interested. I'm reading a biography of Poe right now. So that got me interested in his life and his works in greater detail. Yeah, I'm a D&D fan too. I never played the game, but I created campaigns, believe it or not. And there's a Wizards of the Coast put out a dark fantasy series called Tales of Ravenloft.
Yes.
And that's horror and fantasy, and it's a wonderful series. I love those.
If you can manage to find the books, they've been out of print for ages, but that's what we brought our kid into playing D&D was Ravensloft when he was 12. And
I have
taking it and run.
I have the original books and I have the game too, which is awesome. I just have never played it, believe it or not, but I love the story.
I have, let's see, somebody in the chat room says Ruth Rendell gives her the creeps right to the end of her stories. I don't, what does she write? Ruth Rendell.
Is she a horror or a mystery writer, Patricia?
No, she's a mystery writer. And there's something, she just does these creepy twists at the end every time. It just give me the spinal shivers. So, and Poe wrote a lot of early mysteries also. I mean.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just picked up an anthology that is all stories based on his Murders in the Rue Morgue story.
Excellent.
So it's a take on that, which is great. And as far as markets, I tend to find my markets on different sites. There's a site called Duotrope. There's also a site called Rollin.com if you're interested. Rollin is all speculative fiction. I believe Duotrope is as well. But a lot of times I found the markets that I eventually submitted my stories to through those sites. Of course, I also belong to Horror Writers Association, so they put out a newsletter every month with market listings, that sort of thing. There was another site called Dark Markets, but that's on hiatus. I think the owner of the site had a rough year, and so they're taking some time off. But there's lots out there. The possibilities are endless. I mean, I've primarily been talking short stories, but I mean, you can write novels. There are horror comics, horror graphic novels. Of course, horror movies are even crazier than before. There's lots young adult horror. I mean, it's as endless as your imagination. So you can write whatever you want to in all these subgenres and different mediums.
When I was younger at Butler University, I was studying theater for a long time, and I took some classes with a Broadway makeup designer. And after that, learning about makeup and how you do blood and having things stuck in people's bodies, and it's, all, this was before they had the ability to change it using pixelation instead of, so you had to make it look real for whatever you were doing. And so forevermore after that, you were saying at one point, our minds, you know, they go to the point where I can't believe any more of this because it glosses over.
Mhm.
So I'm looking at something that's full of blood and going, I know how to make that shade in, you know, of blood, you know, because, you know,
Right.
thank God, you know, and so I can sit here and divorce myself instead of getting really sick and grossed out, having, you know, been able to create that at some point. But when I read it, I mean, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, I think, was the first of his I ever read. And I was a teenager at the time, and I was nightmaring for days.
Yeah, I love a lot of the, I mean, you grow up on all this as you're, growing up. One of my favorite authors is W.W. Jacobs. He wrote that story, The Monkey's Paw. That's a wonderful,
Oh, yeah.
wonderful story. I love that one. H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, Dean Koontz. There's just so many influences as I've grown as a writer. And just enjoying the reading, feeding my subconscious and seeing what comes out at the other end as far as what kind of unsettles me and what story ideas spark the next story. I do have a story that I'm currently working on. I did submit it actually to an anthology. It was called Classic Monsters Unleashed, and it was a mummy story. It was called The Reawakened. And it was the first story I had finished in several years because I'd gotten busy with my other career as a nurse. And it was fun to write, and disappointing not to get in the anthology. But that being said, I see this character as a series character. So I could see a series of stories written on this character. I could see a comic book series resulting from this character. So in that respect, I'm glad I wrote the story because I started getting a handle on the character, and I'm going to keep working on it and seeing what other stories come out of it.
When you have all of these different stories in your mind, etc., so many people have had real life experiences with paranormal activity around them one way or another. And, you know, I have had a few myself, and so have other members of my family. Had, my brother was in a house that for some reason they had moved into this house, and for some reason there was one bedroom that they closed off completely because their kid was sleeping in there. They had 3 kids. And he woke up the next morning and terrified. He said, I had this horrible dream. And sure enough, he had cuts on his body. And they were wondering,
wow.
What the hell? And then the older son took that room. And one night he woke up, same thing. He had had like this evil feeling and started screaming, and his father comes up there. And, so when you start seeing something like that, and you'll have people like, Ben Radford's one of my favorite people, but he's a professional skeptic. But I know that my brother and his family are very, very practical people.
Right?
So
Yeah.
where the heck did this come from? And and I've had other elements of things that happened within my family. So when I start reading some of these things, they get a little too close to home.
Personal, yeah.
And I'm wondering, how many people who have had some type of personal experience, if they would avoid stories like that for that reason.
Yeah. I guess it depends on the person. I think some would probably write about it to try to get it off their chest and try to examine what really happened. But then there are others who just kind of avoid it altogether. It was so unsettling. They just don't want to expose themselves to that sort of thing.
And not just that, but to the ridicule.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually talk about it, then people that are skeptics are like, oh, you're just making it all up. Ha, 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 ha.
Right. Same thing like with Bigfoot, a lot of people laugh at that. They laugh it off. There are really people who feel they've seen something and they've like spent most of their lives trying to find this creature. And it's kind of crazy. It really is. But it's fun for me to listen to the stories, and I came up with one. And I saw a movie the other day called Exists. And let me just say, it was a Bigfoot movie. It's one of those movies in the tradition of Blair Witch Project, where it's, you know, the people involved are supposedly filming it and so on. And I have to say, it creeped me out. It creeped me out. And then the movie has not done that in a long time. So if you're into that sort of thing, it's called Exists. And it was pretty good. The Bigfoot was based on the reports that they have of the creature. It was very realistic. It wasn't a hokey costume. It wasn't doing things that it supposedly doesn't do, like coming out just to find people to eat in some of the other movies I've watched. There was a reason why it was provoked, and it was really creepy. It gave me chills at various times throughout the movie. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for and hoping I can create in my fiction when I write these stories.
I've got a couple things here in the chat room, starting up with Patricia. Have you thought about the collective unconsciousness in creating monsters that we would recognize, the terrifying creature? That's kind of like what you were talking about just now.
Yeah. So we have that unconsciousness, all those experiences, the collective human experiences that, you know, that from our past, from our ancestors, that are kind of still residing inside of us, that we're still trying to deal with, our darker natures, that sort of thing. Yeah. And a lot of that can be, a lot of that is expressed a lot of times in metaphor. Vampires, werewolves, all those things can serve as metaphors for some of our unsettling fears and things.
Dolly says, David, you were working on a comic book a few years back. She got the first volume, but never heard of it again. Where did that go?
So the comic book was Amber. It was a medieval story about this gal who develops supernatural powers. And I was co-writing it with two friends of mine from a writing workshop I attended called Odyssey. And we had hired an artist. We were able to get that first issue out, and then things just kind of went sour. Everyone developed different interests, and the artist wasn't interested in any illustrating the book anymore. And so it just kind of got put on hold. It promised to be a good comic book series, but being that the main creator was my friend Darren, I kind of didn't go anywhere with it. I figured that was his project, and I was just kind of helping and along for the ride. So that just kind of went away.
I have a suggestion for you from Robert Speak, who says, how about a story from a Bigfoot perspective?
Hey, Rob. Yes, that would be very interesting. I'd definitely have to think about that one to try to accurately portray that and what kind of thought process that creature would have and so on. So that's a very intriguing concept. I'll keep that in mind.
Let's see, and then there's a couple more in there about Sasquatch. Evolution is about Sasquatch in Washington State destroying a green colony there, told like a journal entry and magazine articles and transcripts by Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z.
I like that. Okay. Yeah, and I have the World War Z. I haven't read that book, but it looks good. So definitely have to check out the Evolution. Eric S. Brown is another author who wrote a Bigfoot War series. And the first book is about this main character whose family was killed by a Sasquatch. So he leaves the town, but then he comes back seeking revenge. The problem is he provokes an entire tribe of Bigfoot who attack the city or the town that he's living in, and things get chaotic from there. And he has a whole series on this called the Bigfoot Wars. So that's pretty fun. That can verge a little bit on the gory side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Too much blood, and it's like, yeah, okay, it's just red paint. Head goes, no, I can't believe this anymore. Okay, then. Does anybody else have any questions? I mean, this has been awesome, David. I mean, that you've given me a lot of information that I've never even considered in that, and especially is how it can help me in stories that are not necessarily specifically horror or suspense, but in using them in my mysteries or other adventures.
Right. And also, I just wanted to point out a few books for people who are interested in writing in the topic. There's been a couple of new ones that have come out that have been really good books. One is called Horror 101, The Way Forward. It's edited by Joe Minhart. And it was put out by Crystal Lake Publishing. They're a publisher of horror anthologies and books about writing in the genre. And then Michael Nost, a friend of mine that I met through Seton Hill, has a book called Writer's Workshop of Horror. This is volume 2. He has put out another one previously, but this has articles by authors such as Stephen King, Anne Rice. There's interviews with other authors like Richard Chismar, who co-wrote a book with Stephen King. Trying to remember the title, something about a button box. Let's see if I can find that real quick. But they have an interview in here, and it talks, Donna Monroe, that gal I told you about from Seton Hill, has an article in here. And it's really great. Gwendy's Button Box. It was co-written by Richard Chismar and Stephen King. So that's a really popular book. And so they have an interview in there. But this has great articles about writing horror and suspense, as well as the other one. There's a couple of older titles. One's called How to Write Tales of Horror, Fantasy, and Science Fiction by J.N. Williamson. He was a great writer in his own right and a wonderful editor. And so he cobbled this collection together of articles on the subject as well. And then William Nolan, F. Nolan, one of my favorite authors, also wrote a How to Write Horror Fiction book back in, I believe, the 80s. So those are all helpful volumes if you're interested in writing horror.